Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the Goodrum Show with me, Chris Goodrum. As per usual, a big thank you to everybody that watched last week's episode of the show, liked, commented, all that kind of stuff. Your support is very much appreciated. Yesterday, in actual fact, I was at the Nottingham Wine Festival, which was really good. Went down pretty well, and met lots of lovely people that tasted our wines, and as often is the case, ended up talking whiskey with a number of people, and obviously mentioned the show. So if you're one of those people that have just started watching the show because of that, then thank you very much for watching. I hope you'll subscribe and keep watching future episodes of the show. Anyway, this week, it was a bit of a funny week. I kind of couldn't really figure out what exactly I wanted to do. I was looking at all the little groups of samples I've got dotted around, and I was sort of going, do I fancy it? No. There was a bit of a reason. It was like, well, I've only got 5 of that, and I've got 4 of that, and and I remembered that a month or so ago I did a couple of grain episodes of the show, so I thought, let's do another grain episode. As you know, big fan of grain whiskies. I think you certainly get a lot of bang for your buck, so to speak. A good sort of aged grain, mid-20s, 30s, is still going to be considerably less money than the same aged single malt, and they're just different. They have a different flavour profile. Yes, when they're young, they can be a bit neutral because it's a highly rectified spirit, and it needs time in the cask to pick up the cask notes and develop complexity through oxidation. Often a lot of grain whiskies will move in either a kind of a rum-like direction or a cognac-esque kind of direction, and I think if you've never tried a grain whiskey, I think that they're worth checking out, and they might not be to your taste, but at least give them a try. I think they're really intriguing. Obviously, part of the reason why a lot of people don't think about grain whiskies or don't rate grain whiskies is because they're seen as an industrial product. All of the grain distilleries, or the vast majority of the grain distilleries, are big plants, almost industrial complexes, and it has this, image of being an industrial product. It's only used in the blends and all that kind of stuff, but we know that's definitely not true. So today's episode, I'm looking at the now closed Cambus distillery. I mean, it was closed in 1993 by the owners, Diageo, when they had a bit of a reorganisation, and I think that they shipped all their grain production out to Cameron Bridge. Since then, it was brought back to life in 2011, but no longer as a distillery itself. It's now the Diageo's main cooperage, and the distillery is still there, but obviously no longer in production. And obviously the building itself is not exactly what you'd call a looker. None of these grain distilleries are particularly what you'd call attractive buildings. I mean, the Cambus distillery was originally founded in 1806 by a chap called John Mowbray, and was a converted ex-mill, like a lot of these distilleries were, like Deanston, for example. And so basically it was originally founded as a malt distillery, but in 30 years after it had been in operation, it was converted to a grain distillery when they installed 2 Stein patent stills, and then subsequently upgraded to a column still in 1851. Up until about, I think it was 1870 odd, the distillery was owned by the same family, then became part of DCL, or Distillers Company Limited, who eventually became Diageo. And it's like a lot of the grain distilleries, doesn't have a particularly sort of, remarkable history. I mean, it's probably not strictly true, but I mean, apparently in the early 1900s, the distillery itself was one of the few grain distilleries that actually released its product for sale to the general public. As you know, practically all the other distilleries were just workhorses for providing grain spirit to the blenders, and it was at the heart of a lawsuit that was brought by a number of malt distilleries that took umbrage with the fact that the grain, or Cambus and grain distilleries as a whole, were calling their spirit whisky, and they basically thought that whisky should only be single malt, all this kind of stuff. And eventually, obviously, they lost that case, and Cambus took out advertising and all this kind of stuff to basically promote its spirit, to basically say, look, you know, it is whisky, you know, it's a grain whisky, it's not a single malt whisky, and it has relevance. And the distillery has continued on. I mean, it had a big fire, I believe, in 1914, then closed. Then there was the war years, and so it has had some history, maybe not quite so much history as some of the malt distilleries, but you know, even so, you can sort of check out the history if you're that way inclined. Obviously, that was not a particularly sort of in-depth bit of historical content, but obviously you're more interested in what I've got in front of me for tasting today. So without further ado, we'll take a look at today's lineup. Right, okay, so today's lineup. Well, we're going to kick off with the Duncan Taylor grain. Now, some of my earliest encounters with grain whiskies were through Duncan Taylor in their rare old range, and unfortunately obviously that range has now since been discontinued, but they still do from time to time bottle grain whiskies in their Octaves, and this is one of their Octaves Cambuses. This was cask number 1112939. It is 25 years old. It was distilled in 1991, bottled in 2017, and spent 9 months in an ex-sherry octave, as you can see from the colour. Second bottling we're going to be looking at is a Hunter Laing Sovereign Cambus. This is 27 years old. Refill bourbon hogshead, HL12279, distilled in September of 1988, bottled in February of 2016 at 46.7%. And we're going to move on to a Douglas Laing Old Particular Cambus. This is 28 years old. Again, refill bourbon hoggy, DL11607, distilled in September of 1988 and bottled in March of 2017. Next one is back to the Hunter Laing Sovereign range. So this is a 30-year-old, again, refill bourbon hoggy. HL1159, distilled in May of 1985 and bottled in May of 2015. Back to Douglas Laing with the penultimate bottling. So this is again another 30-year-old Cambus, this time bottled at 48.5%, again refill bourbon hoggy. DL12754, distilled in September of 1988 and bottled in September of 2018. And the last bottling, back to the Sovereign range again. This is a 40-year-old Cambus, distilled in February 1975, bottled in February of 2015, HL11266. Again, refill bourbon hoggy and bottled at 57.7%. So, interesting range, interesting ages, all should hopefully be interesting. So let's kick off with the Duncan Taylor then, shall we? Right, okay, so let's see what the 25-year-old has on the nose. The octave cask is very noticeable, very obvious, but it's got a lovely maturity. It's treacly, sweet dried fruit, sweet grain dried fruits, licorice, touch of burnt spice. It's got a sort of slightly Armagnac-y kind of character, and I must admit that sherry casks and grain whisky do tend to work quite well together. A lot, the spirit seems to have, you know, the character to withstand the sherry, and certainly in this instance it certainly does. That's a lovely nose. I mean, it's not too overdone, and it's showing some lovely balance between the cask and the spirit. Let's see what the palate's like. Oh, that's grippy. A lot of tannins, dry tannins. A little bit of green wood, dried sherry fruit. It's pretty much all about the octave on the palate. There's a touch of licorice, there's some tar. Again, it's got a lovely mature characteristic. It's certainly the spirit has worked in well with the octave cask, although the octave cask is very, very dominant, and it does dry out the finish a little bit, and there's a little bit of bitterness, but nothing too bitter. It's a little on the short side, and like I said, the palate is veering more into that sherry direction. But on the whole, I think that's quite a pleasant one to start with. Right, okay, so let's move on to the Sovereign 27-year-old. Let's see what the nose gives us on this end, shall we? Now, we're more in kind of classic grain territory. This has got plenty of sort of lightly toasted, vanilla-y oak. It's a bit chunky. The spirit is a little neutral. It's more in that sort of Girvan-y kind of higher toned kind of character. There's a little bit of dried fruit. There's a subtle balsamic note as well. A little bit of toffee, a bit of wood spice. It's pleasant. It's not sort of blowing me out of the water with its complexity, but it's a lovely nose. It's showing that really this is the sort of starting point for bottling a grain. It's still lacking a little bit of complexity, but it's got a lovely freshness to it, and like I say, it's got that lovely sort of high-toned kind of character, and certainly, you know, showing more spirit character than the previous bottling. Anyway, let's see what the palate's like. A little bit more complex on the palate now. Again, opening up with that slightly creamy, toasty oak. Some lighter dried fruits coming through on the middle. A little bit of dried pineapple, apricot. It sort of darkens a little bit towards the sort of like the mid palate and the finish when I get a little bit of darker fruit, a little bit of coffee, almost treacle as well. Again, a little drying on the finish, but it's got a pleasant sweetness as well. It's got a pretty good complex palate in actual fact. It's got some lovely progression. Alright, the nose isn't maybe sort of as complex as the palate, but it's a classic lighter grain whisky, and the thing you will probably notice about, like I said, most of these whiskies at this sort of age, they will have a fair degree of oak character, but that's part of what makes a grain whisky a grain whisky. So yeah, I like that. I thought that was pretty impressive. Right, okay, so let's move on to the old particular 28-year-old. Let's see what the nose gives us on this end, shall we? Now, less oak on the nose on this one, so I'm getting a lot more of the aromatic sweet dried fruits. It's got an almost barley kind of note to it. It's certainly cereal, and it makes it feel a lot younger than 28. And this is the thing, when you're tasting sort of grain whiskies, you kind of have to recalibrate what you consider to be young, what you consider to be mature. And at 28, this is still pretty youthful stuff, it has to be said. There's a little bit of earthiness, there's a little bit of smoke, again quite elegant, in the high toned kind of character. We're not sort of chunky, sort of maybe Dumbarton or something of that kind of ilk. We're in that sort of Girvany kind of Invergordon kind of higher toned area. But it's got a lovely aromatic quality, it's got a lovely sweetness as well. See what the palate gives us. Again, a little bit more oak on the palate, a little bit more vanilla, but it's got a lovely sweetness to it, and certainly has that sort of cereally, almost barley-like character. A little bit of wood spice, a bit of citrus, a good length. It's lingering really nicely, getting that sort of slightly oxidised dried fruit coming through now on the finish. Maybe not quite as complex as the previous 27-year-old, but again, lovely length to it, and certainly enough complexity to keep you interested, shall we say. Right, okay, so let's move on to the Sovereign 30-year-old. Let's see what the nose gives us on this end, shall we? Oh, that's a lovely nose. That's beautifully balanced. Lots of mature, almost toasty oak, toasty toffee, poached pear. We're now starting to move into that sort of almost kind of cognac kind of territory, with that sort of light dried appley fruit. Touch of incense possibly. Nice crispness as well, which is kind of balancing up the sort of the sweetness of the dried fruit. Getting a little biscuity now, a little bit of almost buttery notes as well. I mean, this is a lovely nose. This is showing some real complexity, and this certainly would stand up quite well to a 30-year-old single malt in the complexity department. A little bit of white chocolate as well. That's gorgeous. That is a lovely nose. It really is. See what it passes like. That's delightful. Again, we're in that slight cognac-y kind of character, that sort of dried apple, sweet dried baked fruit, peach, apricot, a little bit of wood spice, a little bit of grippy spice, just nipping in the mid palate, and it kind of emphasises throughout onto the finish. It's got beautiful bittersweet balance. It's got some lovely length. It's got some lovely oak. It's not too oaky. The oak is very harmonious, and the length is absolutely stunning. This really is en point, as they would say, and really at such a lovely age, 30 for a grain whiskey. It's just got that vibrancy on the finish, which is just sort of almost like, emphasising the spices, and absolutely stunning. Right, okay, so let's move on to the old particular 30-year-old Cambus. Now, the first thing you notice about this is the darkness of the colour. So, you instantaneously think, well, possibly, although this has been aged in a refill hoggy, this is obviously going to be quite active on the oak front. And it is. It's quite bourbony. You get a lot of almost kind of corn notes, spicy rye notes, pepper, nutmeg. You could be quite easily forgiven for thinking that this is an American whiskey is that heavily influenced by the cask, but oh, it's gorgeous. It is absolutely sublime. Okay, yeah, we're not getting quite the sort of the spirit character of the previous bottling, but if you like American whiskies, if you like that overt oak character, I mean, that is absolutely gorgeous. I mean, really, really bourbony. A little bit of violets now. Beeswax, yeah, a bit of beeswax as well. That's really complex. I mean, and this goes to show you leave the spirit in, you know, a fairly active cask for 30 odd years, and this is what you get, and it is truly, truly divine. See what the pass like. A multitude of oak character, grippy, spicy, herbal. Again, lots of that sort of corn and almost dark rye spice, ginger, nutmeg, touch of pepper. Oh, the spices are absolutely gorgeous on the finish. It's a little drying. It's a little, I wouldn't quite say short, because the spices and the sort of almost kind of coffee treacly kind of notes are sort of lingering, but it is very, very oaky, and so this is, if you like those, like I said, it is very much in a sort of an American whiskey kind of style, and if you like that, and I mean, and it is absolutely divine. Loads and loads of oak character. Yes, all right, from a purist angle, I think it is probably heavily on the oak character, but even so, I mean, ooh, lovely. Right, okay, so let's finish off with the 40-year-old. Let's see what the nose gives us on this end, shall we? Delicate, mature oak, juicy bourbony kind of notes, but again, we're not as bourbony as the previous bottling. Leather, walnut, raisinated fruit. Again, we're kind of like sort of Armagnac-y, sort of rummy. I mean, it's just absolutely stunning. Touch of demerara sugar, a little bit of rye spice, a little bit of butter. It's a little bit of a noticeable high-toned, slightly grippy, spicy spirit character, a little bit of wood smoke. Unbelievably complex. I mean, it really is just one of these spirits where you stick your nose in the glass and something new suddenly pops up and you go, oh, wow. I mean, it is a real wow nose. I mean, I hate to think how much this would retail for these days, but my God, you're getting a hell of a lot of whiskey, and that is absolutely gorgeous. See what the pal's like. Sublime. It opens up with a little bit of grippy tannin, but the tannins are wonderfully soft. It's a lovely sort of natural, dried, sweet fruit. A little bit of dark treacle, a little bit of dark fruit as well, but some lighter fruit, some sultana, a little bit of raisin as well. Slightly herbal. The spirit kind of is starting to sort of clear the oak a little bit on the mid palate, but the oak kind of sort of comes back on the finish. Again, leather, dark spices, a bit of rye spice, some coffee. Such a chewy, big finish. And again, it's a lot of people kind of think of grain spirit and they think of light and sort of slightly ethereal, and maybe lacking a little bit of body. And this is why they need the time in the oak. It kind of just gives it some flesh on the bones, and all of these, the spirit is still very, very much noticeable. In some, obviously, more so than others, but oh, the length on that is just absolutely divine, and lovely way to finish on. Right, okay, so that's some today's episode of the show. So what have we learned about Cambus? It's certainly in the lighter end of the grain spirit. So we're in the sort of the Girvan, the Invergordon sort of end of the spectrum, as opposed to sort of Dumbarton and a couple of the other ones, which tend to be sort of a little bit heavier, a little bit more oilier. This has got that lovely sort of lightness to it. The Duncan Taylor, yeah, I mean that was lovely. I mean, like I said, you know, grain whiskey does kind of work quite well with sherry, and it certainly stood up to the pounding it got in those sherry octaves. I think I preferred the nose to the palate. The palate was a little bit heavily sherried and a little bit drying and a little bit tannic. But certainly I think that was a lovely whiskey. The Sovereign 27-year-old, yeah, I mean a lovely spirit. You know, can't complain about that one. Again, displaying plenty of sort of American oak on the nose. Obviously not quite as much as some of the later ones, but I think still a lovely bottling in its own right. The 28-year-old, again, a lovely spirit. It had more spirit character. The oak was a bit more subtle, I suppose, and again, it showed its quality. The 30-year-old, I mean, that was beautiful. That was classically old grain in that sort of slight sort of cognac-esque kind of character. Slow to unwind, but you know, lots of character, lots of personality, and yeah, lovely finish. The old particular 30-year-old, like I said, you know, if you were to put that in with the tasting of American whiskies, you'd probably be well and truly fooled into thinking that was an American whiskey. Very active cask, lots of Bourbony character, but again, the spirit was noticeable, and the spiciness was just absolutely gorgeous. I mean, so another absolutely stunning bottling. And the 40-year-old, which was it's not always the case of the oldest whiskey as the star of the show, but I mean certainly that was, I mean, and that was just absolutely divine, just beautifully balanced, and showing how old grain can move in this sort of like cognac-y kind of rummy kind of characteristic, and the complexity was just absolutely stunning, it just had that lovely mature character, that sort of old leather and walnuts and that kind of thing. But again, you know, the spirit was definitely evident. It wasn't swamped by the oak, and was just, at the end of the day, just absolutely gorgeous. So, like I said, look out for some old grains. I mean, they're still really good value for money in my opinion, and yeah,